The story has always told us about the confusion of languages, but it rarely explains why that tower was considered such a serious threat. Thousands of years ago, on the plains of Mesopotamia, humanity began a project that seemed to challenge every known limit of its time. It was not merely an unfinished construction, nor a simple narrative about human pride. It was an attempt to create a unified, centralized society capable of controlling its own destiny. But what led entire peoples to dedicate their strength, their resources, and their lives to a single colossal work? What was really happening in Babel before everything was interrupted? Today, you will discover the truth behind the Babel project. To understand the magnitude of this event, we need to return to the first centuries after the great flood described in Genesis. The waters had receded, the fields were producing food again, and new generations were growing rapidly. Yet, the collective memory of the catastrophe remained alive.
And the whole earth was of one language and of one speech. Genesis 11:1.
The known world had witnessed unprecedented destruction, and the stories of that event were passed from parents to children. The fear of a new tragedy was part of everyday reality. Storms, seasonal floods, and natural climate changes could easily rekindle deep memories of vulnerability and insecurity. It was within this context that one of the most intriguing figures of the post-flood period emerged. The book of Genesis mentions Nimrod as a mighty hunter before the Lord and as the founder of important urban centers in ancient Mesopotamia. Although the biblical text provides few details about his political activity, ancient traditions and historical interpretations often associate him with the process of centralization that led to the rise of Babel. Regardless of the exact extent of his influence, one thing is evident. Strong leadership was able to convince thousands of people to remain gathered in a single place, contrary to the natural dispersion that normally occurs as populations grow. The proposal was appealing. Instead of spreading across unknown territories and facing risks, scarcity, and isolation, people could concentrate resources, knowledge, and labor in a single city. The larger the population gathered together, the greater the capacity to produce food, organize defense, and carry out ambitious projects. The city offered security. The city offered stability. And above all, it offered the feeling of control over a world that still seemed unpredictable. It was then that the idea of the tower was born. The biblical account records the intention to build a city and a tower whose top would reach the heavens, making the name of that people famous and preventing their dispersion across the earth. For centuries, scholars have debated the exact meaning of this declaration. Some see it as a symbol of spiritual pride. Others view it as an unprecedented project of political centralization. What seems clear is that the construction represented far more than architecture. It became a visible symbol of human confidence in its own ability to shape the future without external limits. Before we go deeper into the secrets and engineering of this megastructure, I want to take a brief pause. If the raw reality of this story is capturing your attention and you value this level of documentary depth, leave a like on the video so our content can reach even further. Seeing the boldness and technological ambition of these ancient civilizations makes me think a lot about the people who follow these documentaries. I would like to get to know you better today. Are you a Christian who attends a church? Someone who enjoys studying the roots of the Bible on your own? or simply a lover of ancient history and archaeology? Leave your answer in the comments so I can know. I will read and respond to everyone with great care. Now, let us return to Babylon. To understand why Babel became such a powerful symbol, we need to abandon the simplified image of a group of workers randomly stacking bricks in the middle of the desert. What was emerging on the plain of Shinar was an enterprise that required planning, organization, and technical knowledge far beyond what we normally imagine when thinking about the earliest civilizations. The great question was not merely how high the tower could rise, but how an ancient society managed to mobilize enough resources to sustain a construction project of that scale for years. The geography of the region played a decisive role in this process. Mesopotamia was an extraordinarily fertile land thanks to the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Abundant harvests made it possible to feed large populations and generate agricultural surpluses. These surpluses created something fundamental for any great project: workers who could temporarily leave rural activities and dedicate themselves to construction. For the first time, thousands of people could be concentrated on a single project without immediately compromising collective survival. But there was a significant problem. Unlike Egypt, where enormous stone blocks could be extracted from quarries, the plain of Shinar possessed few rocky resources suitable for monumental construction. The builders needed another solution. They turned to the most abundant material available: clay. Genesis itself preserves this detail by stating that they decided to make bricks and fire them thoroughly. It may seem like a simple piece of information, but it reveals an extremely important technological shift in the ancient world. Sun-dried bricks had been known for a very long time. They were used in houses, walls, and small buildings throughout various regions. The problem was their fragility in the face of moisture and climatic changes. When subjected to the intense heat of kilns, however, these blocks underwent a physical transformation that significantly increased their strength. The result was a material that was more durable, more uniform, and far better suited to support large structural loads. This innovation required an impressive operation. It was not enough to produce a few thousand bricks. A monumental construction would consume millions of units throughout its execution. Kilns had to operate continuously. Workers collected clay, transported water, molded blocks, and fed the fires without interruption. The entire city began to revolve around the project. Construction ceased to be merely an economic activity and became the center of collective life. However, bricks were only half of the equation. The other fundamental element was what held them together. Once again, Genesis preserves an extraordinary detail. Instead of ordinary mortar, they used bitumen. The Mesopotamian region possessed natural deposits of this dark, viscous substance that emerged from the ground. Ancient peoples were already familiar with its waterproofing and adhesive properties, using it in boats, reservoirs, and other structures. In Babel, however, its use reached a much greater scale. The combination of fired bricks and bitumen created an extremely efficient construction technology for that time. The walls became more resistant to erosion, infiltration, and weather-related deterioration. It was not a supernatural or impossible technology. It was the result of practical observation, accumulated experience, and humanity's ability to solve concrete problems through engineering. And it was precisely this capability that began to fuel an ever-growing confidence in the strength of their own hands. As the levels of the construction advanced, a new mentality began to emerge. Every row of bricks reinforced the feeling that nothing was impossible for that generation. The city was growing. Supply systems were functioning. Material production maintained the expected pace. The project was progressing. Constant success produced a powerful psychological effect. The more the structure grew, the more people believed they could overcome any limit that stood before them. Managing this gigantic operation required coordination on a scale rarely seen in the ancient world. Teams had to be organized, resources distributed, inventories controlled, transportation supervised, and a permanent flow of materials maintained to the upper levels of the structure. The construction site functioned like a complex machine where thousands of different tasks needed to operate in perfect synchronization to avoid delays and waste. All of this was facilitated by a unique condition described in the biblical account itself. Everyone spoke the same language. There were no linguistic barriers hindering communication. Orders were understood instantly. Technical instruction circulated without distortion. Knowledge and experience could be shared rapidly among different groups. Cooperation reached an extraordinary level of efficiency. And it was precisely this combination of technology, organization, and unity that transformed Babel into something far greater than a simple tower. For the first time, humanity was beginning to experience the power of acting as a single, unified civilization. And this collective strength would soon begin to generate consequences that no one was prepared to face. The tower no longer existed only in the plans of architects or in the promises of leaders. It dominated the landscape of the plain of Shinar. As new levels were completed, its presence became impossible to ignore. From virtually any point in the region, it was possible to see the structure rising above ordinary buildings, casting an ever-growing shadow over the city, expanding around it. What had begun as a collective enterprise was rapidly becoming the gravitational center of the entire known civilization. But the deepest transformation was not taking place in the bricks, the ramps, or the terraces of the construction. It was taking place in the minds of the people. The continuous success of the project produced a silent shift in the way that generation viewed itself. For years, fear had been the primary force driving its decisions. The trauma of the ancient waters fueled the need for protection, stability, and permanence. Now, however, something different was beginning to occupy that space. Confidence gained through their own achievements was growing day by day. The workers watched the structure rise ever higher. Administrators saw resources arriving without interruption. Builders solved problems that had seemed impossible only a few years earlier. The city prospered. Production increased. Organization functioned. Little by little, the sense of dependence gave way to a conviction of self-sufficiency. Humanity was beginning to believe that it had finally found a way to control its own destiny. It is important to understand that the biblical account does not present the tower as a problem simply because of its height. No amount of bricks could literally reach the dwelling place of God. The central issue was never architectural. The problem lay in the intention behind the construction. The text highlights two fundamental motivations: to make a name for themselves and to avoid being scattered across the earth. These two decisions reveal far more than urban ambition. They reveal a conscious attempt to replace dependence on the Creator with absolute confidence in human capability. The city and the tower became symbols of a new model of society, a model in which security, identity, and purpose would not be found in God, but in the collective strength of civilization itself. The unity that had initially served to build was now beginning to fuel something far more dangerous, the conviction that no limits existed above human will. The more efficient the organization became, the more difficult it was to recognize any authority beyond itself. The social structure itself reinforced this process. A single language allowed instant communication. A single project concentrated the efforts of the population. A single leadership coordinated resources. A single objective guided millions of individual decisions. This convergence produced an extraordinary capacity for execution. Ideas were shared rapidly. Solutions circulated without obstacles. Knowledge accumulated continuously. For the first time in recorded history, humanity functioned almost like a single collective organism. It was precisely this reality that the biblical text highlights when it describes the divine observation regarding the city. The passage states that the people were one and had one language, and that this was only the beginning of what they would accomplish. Many modern interpretations treat this statement as a kind of compliment to human potential. But the context suggests something very different. The problem was not intelligence, creativity, or technical capability. The problem was the moral direction toward which all that power was being directed. The history of humanity repeatedly demonstrates that technology and organization are neutral tools. They can produce prosperity, development, and protection. But they can also be used for concentration of power, oppression, and destruction. The greater a society's capacity for coordination, the greater both its possibilities and its risks become. Babel represented precisely this critical point, a humanity that was highly efficient, unified, and powerful, yet moving in a direction of growing independence from its own creator. The construction site functioned as a daily demonstration of this collective strength. Thousands of voices repeated the same commands. Caravans transported materials without interruption. Entire teams worked in perfect coordination. The social machine seemed to operate flawlessly. And just when that generation believed it was closest to achieving its great objective, something unexpected began to happen. No earthquakes appeared. No lightning struck the tower. No army emerged on the horizon. The intervention that would change the course of history would attack directly the element that made that entire civilization possible, its ability to understand one another. The fall of Babel did not happen in the way we usually imagine. There are no biblical records of earthquakes bringing down the tower, fires consuming its structures, or a physical catastrophe destroying the city within minutes. The account presents something far more surprising. The most ambitious construction of its time was not defeated by an engineering failure, a lack of resources, or the forces of nature. It collapsed because it lost the very thing that sustained its entire existence, the ability to communicate. Up to that moment, the city functioned like a perfectly synchronized mechanism. Orders circulated rapidly. Knowledge was shared without obstacles. Problems were identified and solved efficiently. An architect could transmit complex instructions to dozens of teams without fear of misunderstandings. Supervisors coordinated thousands of workers using the same terms, the same measurements, and the same concepts. Linguistic unity was the invisible cement that kept the entire social structure functioning. It was precisely this element that changed. The biblical text describes that God confused the language of the people, preventing them from continuing to understand one another. The narrative does not explain the mechanisms of this process. We do not know whether the change occurred instantly or progressively. What we do know is the result. People who had previously cooperated perfectly could no longer communicate even basic information to one another. Imagine for a moment the impact of this rupture on a project of that magnitude. A master builder tries to direct the installation of a new structural platform, but his assistants no longer understand the instructions. Workers receive contradictory commands. Teams responsible for transporting materials follow different directions. Supervisors fail to interpret reports correctly. Small errors begin appearing in every sector simultaneously. What once functioned like a coordinated machine starts producing increasing confusion. In simple projects, communication failures can generate delays. In a mega structure that depends on thousands of workers operating in perfect synchronization, they can completely paralyze the system. Every sector depends on the others. Brick makers must understand the needs of the builders. Transporters must comprehend the routes defined by administrators. Supply managers must coordinate food, water, and fuel for dozens of different groups. When language ceases to fulfill this function, the entire network begins to fragment. But the impact was not merely technical, it was profoundly human. Language does not serve only to transmit orders. It allows people to build trust, share experiences, resolve conflicts, and maintain relationships. When people stopped understanding one another, something far deeper than an engineering project began to unravel. Spontaneous cooperation disappeared. Predictability disappeared. The sense of belonging to a single people began to crumble. Leadership also suffered an immediate blow. All authority depends upon the ability to communicate. A ruler may possess armies, resources, and influence, but loses effectiveness when his words are no longer understood. Speeches no longer persuade. Orders no longer produce results. Strategies cannot be executed. The centralized system that sustained Babel depended upon linguistic unity for survival. When that unity vanished, the entire model of power began to collapse. Naturally, people began seeking out those they could still understand. Small groups started forming spontaneously. Families, workers, and communities gathered around those who shared the same language. The city that had been built to unite humanity began moving in the opposite direction. Instead of converging, it started dividing. Instead of concentrating populations, it began dispersing them. Instead of strengthening centralization, it produced fragmentation. Little by little, the gigantic construction site lost its rhythm. The kilns no longer operated at the same intensity. The teams became disorganized. The transport of materials declined. Large sections of the project were abandoned. The tower did not need to be torn down in order to fail. It simply stopped advancing. The project that symbolized the absolute unity of humanity became an unfinished monument to human limitation. The irony of the story is impossible to ignore. The people had begun the construction in order to avoid being scattered across the earth. Yet that is exactly what happened. The dispersion they had tried to prevent became inevitable. The city built to concentrate humanity ultimately accelerated its separation. And as groups departed from Babel in different directions, they carried with them not only new languages, but also knowledge, traditions, and distinct ways of understanding the world. From that moment onward, human history would enter a new phase, a phase marked by the diversity of peoples, cultures, and civilizations that would shape the centuries to come. When human groups began abandoning the plain of Shinar, the Babel project came to an end. The tower remained unfinished. The city lost its original purpose. The dream of gathering all humanity under a single political, cultural, and linguistic structure vanished before reaching its ultimate objective. But the influence of that episode did not end with the abandonment of the construction site. In fact, it was precisely at that moment that its impact began spreading throughout the world. As populations migrated into new regions, they carried with them everything they had learned during the years of construction. Agricultural knowledge, methods of urban organization, brick-making techniques, irrigation systems, and cultural traditions traveled together with those groups. The dispersion did not completely erase Babel's legacy. It fragmented it. Elements of that civilization began appearing in different parts of the ancient world, adapted to the local realities of each people. Modern archaeologists observe that various ancient civilizations developed impressive monumental structures. In Mesopotamia, great ziggurats emerged. In Egypt, monumental pyramids were erected. In different regions, elevated temples, ceremonial platforms, and increasingly sophisticated urban complexes appeared. It is important to emphasize that there is no direct archaeological evidence linking all these structures to the Tower of Babel. Nevertheless, they demonstrate a common characteristic of the human experience, the constant desire to build, organize, and transform the environment around us. The story of Babel, therefore, is not merely a narrative about different languages. It addresses something much deeper. It speaks about the relationship between capability and purpose. The biblical account does not condemn human intelligence. It does not condemn engineering, architecture, or technological development. On the contrary, the very ability to create, plan, and innovate is part of the qualities that distinguish humanity. The problem arises when acquired power begins to be viewed as a substitute for wisdom, moral responsibility, and dependence upon God. This tension accompanies human history. In virtually every era, societies have achieved extraordinary advances and begun to believe that they had found the definitive solution to their problems. Empires appeared invincible. Cities seemed eternal. Political systems looked unshakable. Yet, generation after generation discovered the same reality. No structure built by human hands is capable of completely eliminating the limits of the human condition. No technology removes the risk of error. No social organization entirely eliminates pride, corruption, or conflict. Perhaps that is precisely why Babel continues to generate so much interest thousands of years later. The narrative does not belong only to the distant past of Mesopotamia. It functions as a mirror through which we can observe recurring tendencies within humanity itself. The desire for absolute security, the pursuit of total control, excessive confidence in human capability, The temptation to believe that technical progress and material power are sufficient to solve all the fundamental questions of existence. When we look at the modern world, it is impossible not to notice some interesting parallels. We live in an age of instant communication. People on different continents speak to one another within seconds. Digital systems connect billions of individuals. Information travels across the planet with almost no barriers. For the first time in history, humanity operates within a global communication network that brings cultures, economies, and societies together in an unprecedented way. Naturally, this reality raises fascinating questions. Is modern technology helping us cooperate more intelligently, or is it creating new forms of dependence? Has unlimited access to information made us wiser or merely faster? Are we using our collective capabilities to build a better future, or are we repeating old patterns of arrogance that accompanied previous civilizations? These questions do not have simple answers, yet they are exactly what makes the story of Babel so relevant even today. The ruins of ancient Babylon remained buried beneath the sand for centuries. Empires rose and disappeared. Kings were forgotten. Languages changed. Borders were redrawn countless times. Yet the principal lesson of that episode remains alive. Humanity's true challenge was never merely to build great works. The true challenge has always been deciding for what purpose those works would be used. And this brings us to the final reflection of this documentary. The Tower of Babel was not merely a construction of bricks and bitumen. It represented a worldview. It represented humanity's attempt to find security, identity, and meaning exclusively through its own achievements. The biblical account invites us to reflect upon the limits of that pursuit and upon the importance of balancing knowledge, power, and moral responsibility. The thought-provoking question I leave with you is simple, yet extremely relevant. Looking at the rapid pace of technology, artificial intelligence, and global connectivity, do you believe we have learned the lessons of Babel, or are we repeating in new forms the same mistakes of the past? Write your opinion in the comments below. I truly want to hear your perspective, and I will read every response. Maintaining this work of research, historical analysis, and documentary production requires constant dedication. If you value this type of content and would like to support the continuation of the channel, consider becoming part of our membership club. Your participation directly helps maintain the quality of research, editorial independence, and the production of future documentaries. Thank you very much for following this investigation all the way to the end. It has been a privilege to share this journey through history, archaeology, and the biblical accounts with you. I will see you in the next documentary.